June 4, 1944. 28 days before Allied forces would storm the beaches of Normandy. 31 days before the world would witness the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But on this particular night, off the desolate coast of West Africa, the course of World War II was about to shift in ways no one could have imagined. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, churning battlefield, without borders, without mercy, without witnesses. Black water met black sky at an invisible horizon. The only sounds were the relentless rhythm of waves against steel hulls and the anxious ping of sonar equipment cutting through the darkness below. For 5 brutal years, German U-boats had ruled these depths with an iron grip. They were Hitler's wolves of the Atlantic, silent predators that prowled the shipping lanes between America and Europe. Their mission was simple yet devastating: strangle the Allied supply lines, cut Britain off from the world, and starve the war effort into submission. By 1942, they were sinking Allied vessels faster than shipyards could replace them. Sometimes 5 ships a day, sometimes more. Tankers loaded with precious fuel erupted into floating infernos. Cargo ships carrying food, ammunition, and medical supplies slipped beneath the waves in minutes. Troop transports became underwater tombs for thousands of young men who never saw combat, never even reached the war. The statistics were staggering and terrifying. By mid-1943, German U-boats had sent more than 3,000 Allied ships to the bottom of the ocean, representing over 14 million tons of shipping. Tens of thousands of sailors, merchant mariners, and soldiers had perished in the cold Atlantic waters, many drowning in oil-slicked seas or freezing to death while waiting for rescue that never came. But by June 1944, the tide was beginning to turn. New technologies, radar, sonar, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers, were making the Atlantic increasingly hostile to German submarines. The hunters were gradually becoming the hunted. U-boat losses were mounting. Crews that once sailed with confidence now departed German ports knowing the odds of returning were slim and growing slimmer with each patrol. That night, Task Group 22.3, a hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier Guadalcanal, was conducting anti-submarine patrols approximately 150 miles off the coast of French West Africa. The task group consisted of the carrier and 5 destroyer escorts: the Pope, Flaherty, Pillsbury, Chatelaine, and Jenks. Their mission was straightforward: find German U-boats and destroy them before they could reach the busy shipping lanes further north. Captain Daniel V Gallery commanded the Guadalcanal. He was an unconventional officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics and creative thinking. While other commanders were content to sink U-boats with depth charges, Gallery had become obsessed with a different idea, an idea his superiors considered somewhere between audacious and insane. He wanted to capture one alive. The strategic value of such a capture would be immeasurable. Every U-boat carried codebooks, cipher machines, technical manuals, and operational orders. The Germans used the famous Enigma machine to encrypt their naval communications, and while Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park had made significant progress in breaking these codes, they needed a constant supply of fresh keys and settings. A captured submarine could provide a treasure trove of intelligence that might save thousands of lives and shorten the war by months or even years. But the obstacles were formidable. U-boats were designed to sink quickly when damaged, their crews trained to scuttle them rather than allow capture. German sailors carried demolition charges and were under strict orders to destroy sensitive equipment before abandoning ship. Every previous encounter had ended the same way: depth charges, oil slicks, debris, bodies, sometimes survivors, but never an intact submarine. Gallery had trained his men anyway. He had organized boarding parties, stockpiled pumps and damage control equipment, and drilled his crews on the unlikely scenario of capturing an enemy submarine in the middle of the ocean. His officers thought he was mad. His men weren't sure what to think. At approximately 11 p.m. on June 4th, the sonar operator aboard the destroyer escort Chatelaine detected something unusual. A contact bearing 265 degrees, range approximately 800 yards. But this contact was different from the typical U-boat encounter. It wasn't moving fast, attempting to outrun the the hunters as most U-boats did when detected on the surface. It wasn't diving deep, seeking safety in the cold layers where sonar lost accuracy. It wasn't maneuvering aggressively, trying to position itself for a desperate torpedo shot at its pursuers. It was almost hesitant, uncertain, as if the submarine itself couldn't decide what to do. The contact wasn't attacking. It wasn't running. It was waiting. Commander Dudley S. Knox, aboard the Chatelaine, didn't hesitate. His orders were clear. Attack immediately. Give the enemy no time to dive or maneuver. Within seconds, the destroyer escort's crew sprang into action. Depth charges were armed and rolled off the stern, set to detonate at different depths. A deadly pattern designed to crush the submarine's pressure hull, or at least force it to the surface. The ocean erupted. Massive columns of water shot skyward as the depth charges detonated in sequence. Each explosion sent devastating pressure waves through the water, compressing and expanding in deadly pulses that could rupture a submarine's hull, shatter instruments, knock men unconscious, or simply terrorize a crew into making fatal mistakes. Inside U-505, chaos reigned. The submarine shook violently with each nearby explosion. Light bulbs shattered. Men were thrown against equipment. The acrid smell of chlorine gas created when seawater mixed with battery acid began filling the compartments. The captain, Harold Lange, knew his boat was in trouble. Mechanical failures had plagued this patrol from the beginning, and now, caught on the surface by American warships, his options were evaporating fast. Then, something happened that no one in Task Group 22.3 expected. Instead of diving deeper to escape the depth charge attack, the submarine suddenly began to rise. Lookouts aboard the Chatelaine strained their eyes against the darkness. Searchlights swept across the waves, and then they saw it, a dark shape breaking the surface, water cascading off its rounded hull, its conning tower emerging like some prehistoric creature rising from the depths. A German U-boat, alive, intact, and surfacing directly in front of them. Men aboard the American ship stood frozen for a heartbeat, stunned by what they were witnessing. In nearly 3 years of Atlantic combat, none of them had ever seen a U-boat surface voluntarily during an attack. The submarines always fought to the last moment, diving deep, launching desperate torpedo attacks, or scuttling themselves rather than surrendering. But this one was different. As the submarine wallowed in the swells, hatches burst open and German sailors began spilling onto the deck, silhouetted against the night sky. Some raised their hands in surrender. Others jumped into the water, preferring to take their chances in the ocean rather than remain aboard a sinking submarine. Captain Gallery, monitoring the radio traffic from the Guadalcanal, heard the reports coming in and immediately understood what he was witnessing. This was the opportunity he had been preparing for, the chance that everyone had told him would never come. He grabbed the radio and transmitted a single, urgent command to his boarding party. Get over there. Get aboard. Save that submarine. What the Americans didn't know yet, what they couldn't possibly have known as they prepared their boats and gathered their equipment, was that this wasn't just any U-boat. U-505 was carrying something Berlin never intended the Allies to see. Secrets that could change the entire course of the Battle of the Atlantic, technology that Hitler's engineers had worked years to perfect, intelligence that could save thousands of Allied lives. But first, they had to keep it from sinking, and they had only minutes to do it. Section 2. Inside the Iron Coffin. The submarine listing before them was U-505, and it was a veteran killer with a deadly pedigree. Since its commissioning in August 1941, this Type XQ boat had conducted 12 war patrols, prowling the Atlantic from the frozen waters off Greenland to the tropical coasts of West Africa. 8 Allied merchant ships were painted on its conning tower, each silhouette representing a vessel sent to the bottom, a crew condemned to the depths, cargo lost forever to the war effort. But now, on the night of June 4, 1944, U-505 sat crippled and dying in the Atlantic swells. Smoke poured from its open hatches, illuminated by the searchlights of circling American warships. The submarine's deck was slick with oil and seawater, tilted at a dangerous angle that suggested flooding somewhere deep in its hull. What had happened inside the submarine in those final moments before surfacing was a cascade of failures, both mechanical and human, that would ultimately save the vessel from the fate its crew intended for it. When the first depth charges had exploded nearby, U-505 was already in poor condition. The submarine had been plagued with mechanical problems throughout this patrol, its 13th, which the superstitious crew had noted with grim humor before departure. The boat's diesel engines were unreliable, crucial equipment kept breaking down, and crew morale was dangerously low. Their captain, Oberleutnant Harold Lange, was on his first patrol as commander of U-505, and the pressure of leading a troubled boat in increasingly dangerous waters had taken its toll on his judgment. When the depth charges began falling, Lodge made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of crash diving deep as doctrine demanded, he ordered the submarine to dive to periscope depth just 60 feet, believing he could observe the destroyers above and perhaps slip away in the confusion. It was a fatal miscalculation. A depth charge exploded close enough to rupture the submarine's hull in multiple places. Seawater began flooding into the stern torpedo room. The boat's electrical system short-circuited, plunging the interior into darkness except for emergency lighting. The chief engineer reported that the damaged control pumps were failing, and water was rising faster than they could contain it. In the control room, amid the screaming alarms and shouts of frightened men, Lange panicked. He gave the order that every U-boat commander dreaded having to issue: abandon ship. But the order was premature, given in a moment of terror rather than careful assessment. The flooding, while serious, was not yet catastrophic. The submarine could still surface. The engines could still function. With proper damage control, U-505 might have fought its way clear, or at least managed a controlled scuttling that would send it to the bottom with all its secrets intact. Instead, chaos erupted aboard the submarine. The crew began the scuttling procedure, opening seacocks, destroying radio equipment, gathering codebooks to throw overboard. But in the darkness, confusion, and panic, many of these crucial steps were either done incorrectly or not completed at all. Some valves were only partially opened. Demolition charges were set but not armed. The Enigma machine and its codebooks were supposed to be thrown into the ocean weighted down with wrenches and spare parts. But in the frantic rush to the surface, they were left behind. When U-505 burst through the surface, crew members scrambled through the hatches expecting the boat to sink beneath them at any moment. Some jumped immediately into the oil-slicked water. Others stood on the slippery deck, hands raised in surrender, while still others tried desperately to finish the scuttling procedure, even as American searchlights blazed across the submarine's hull. Aboard the Guadalcanal, Captain Gallery watched through binoculars as the German crew abandoned their submarine. He had planned for this moment obsessively, but even he couldn't quite believe it was happening. The odds against successfully boarding and capturing an enemy submarine in the middle of the Atlantic were astronomical, but the opportunity was there, floating wounded in the darkness, and Gallery was not a man to let opportunities pass. He barked orders into the radio. The destroyer escort Pillsbury, commanded by Lieutenant George W. Castleman, was closest to the submarine. Gallery ordered Castleman to launch his boarding party immediately. On the Pillsbury, Lieutenant Albert David commanded the boarding party. 8 sailors who had trained for months on a scenario most of them believed would never occur. They were equipped with pistols, flashlights, fire axes, bolt cutters, and damage control equipment. None of them spoke German. None of them had ever been inside a U-boat. They were about to board a hostile submarine that might be booby-trapped, might explode at any moment, might sink beneath their feet before they could even get below deck. Lieutenant David knew the risks. They all did. But he also knew the value of what they might capture, and he knew that every second counted. A whaleboat was lowered into the rolling seas. The 8-man boarding party climbed down, and the coxswain gunned the motor, steering toward the wallowing U-boat. The ocean was rough, with 6-foot swells that made the approach treacherous. The whaleboat slammed against the submarine's hull, metal screeching against metal, and the boarding party leapt across the gap with their weapons drawn. They expected resistance, a last stand by fanatical Nazi sailors, or booby traps left behind to kill anyone who dared board. They expected hatches rigged with grenades, or hidden defenders waiting in the darkness below. What they found instead was an abandoned ghost ship. The deck was empty except for a few items of discarded clothing and equipment. All the German sailors had either jumped into the water or were being fished out by the other destroyer escorts. U-505 sat alone in the Atlantic, wounded and flooding, but not yet dead. Lieutenant David approached the conning tower hatch cautiously. It stood open, smoke and diesel fumes billowing out into the night air. He could hear water sloshing somewhere below, and the groan of stressed metal as the submarine rolled in the swells. This was the moment of truth. If there were demolition charges set to explode, they would likely be just below the hatch, a final act of defiance to prevent capture. If there were defenders left aboard, they would be waiting in the narrow confines of the control room, where a single man with a pistol could hold off an entire boarding party. David took a deep breath, checked that his pistol was ready, and descended into the darkness. The interior of U-505 was like something from a nightmare. Emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow. Water was ankle deep in some compartments and rising. Pipes hissed and leaked leaked. Gauges spun wildly, their needles bouncing against maximum readings. Electrical cables sparked where seawater had shorted them out. The air was thick with diesel fumes, chlorine gas, and the acrid smell of hot metal. The boat was dying, and if they didn't act fast, it would take all its secrets to the bottom. David and his boarding party began a frantic race against time. They needed to stop the flooding, but they didn't know where the seacocks were located or how the German damage control systems worked. Every valve, every control panel, every gauge was labeled in German, a language none of them could read. Seaman Arthur Kniespel, one of the boarding party members, found himself in the control room staring at dozens of valves and levers, having no idea which ones controlled flooding and which ones might blow the ballast tanks or activate scuttling charges. He began systematically checking each one, turning wheels clockwise if water seemed to be coming in, opening valves if they seemed to be holding back compressed air. It was desperate, improvised work, part courage, part guesswork, part desperate prayer. In the stern torpedo room, Radioman Second Class Stanley WWII discovered the source of the worst flooding, a damaged section of hull where the depth charge had torn the metal. Water was pouring in at an alarming rate. He and another sailor began stuffing mattresses, clothing, anything they could find into the gap, trying to slow the deluge even slightly. Meanwhile, Lieutenant David explored deeper into the submarine, his flashlight beam cutting through the smoke and darkness. In the radio room, he found the Enigma machine still in place, its rotors set to the day's cipher settings. Nearby were lockers containing codebooks, signal tables, and classified documents that the crew had been supposed to destroy. They hadn't completed the job. The realization hit David like a physical blow. They had captured more than just a submarine. They had captured the keys to Hitler's naval communications network, but only if they could keep the damn boat from sinking. Back on the surface, more sailors from the Pillsbury and other ships in the task group were ferried over to help with damage control. Pumps were lowered into the submarine. Damage control parties worked frantically to shore up bulkheads and plug leaks. Engineers familiar with diesel systems managed to get one of the submarine's own pumps working, helping to push water out faster than it was coming in. For 3 hours, American sailors fought to save an enemy submarine in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was an act of pure audacity, a defiance of every conventional naval wisdom, a gamble that could have ended with the deaths of everyone aboard if the submarine had suddenly plunged to the depths. But slowly, agonizingly, the tide began to turn. The flooding was brought under control. The list decreased as water was pumped out. The submarine stabilized. By dawn on June 5, 1944, U-505 was floating level in the water, still damaged but no longer in immediate danger of sinking. An American ensign had been raised above the German flag on the conning tower, a sight that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. When the final accounting was done, the achievement was staggering. U-505 became the first enemy warship captured by the United States Navy since the War of 1812, when the US Peacock had taken Nautilus during naval battles with Britain. 132 years later, American sailors had done it again. Yet as Captain Gallery surveyed his prize through the morning light, he knew that the real shock, the discovery that would change the entire course of the naval war, was still waiting below deck in the steel compartments of U-505, and the race to exploit those secrets before Germany realized what had happened was only just beginning. Section 3. Hitler's Secret Arsenal. As the morning sun rose over the Atlantic on June 5, 1944, American sailors began the methodical process of searching every compartment of their captured prize. What had been a desperate race to prevent U-505 from sinking had now transformed into something far more significant, an intelligence operation that would require careful documentation of everything found aboard the submarine. Teams of specialists were ferried over from the Guadalcanal, intelligence officers, technical experts, photographers, and sailors with specific skills in cryptography and German naval equipment. They expected to find useful items, perhaps some operational charts, maybe a few code settings, possibly some intelligence about German naval tactics. Standard captures from U-boat wrecks had yielded such materials before, though usually water-damaged and incomplete. What they discovered instead would exceed their wildest expectations and freeze them in their tracks. Locked inside reinforced steel compartments in the forward and aft torpedo rooms were weapons unlike anything the Americans had encountered before. These weren't the standard G7A or G7E torpedoes they had read about in intelligence briefings. These torpedoes were sleek, complex, and covered with unusual equipment, hydrophones mounted near the nose, sophisticated guidance systems integrated into the warhead warhead section, and circuitry far more advanced than conventional torpedo designs. Lieutenant Commander John E. Cadel, an ordnance specialist who had studied German weapon systems for years, examined the torpedoes with growing astonishment. He recognized them immediately from fragmentary intelligence reports that had circulated for months among Allied naval commanders, reports that many had dismissed as exaggerated or unreliable. These were T-5 Zonnig acoustic homing torpedoes, Wren in English, nicknamed NOT, Novel Acoustic Torpedo, by Allied intelligence. Unlike conventional torpedoes that ran straight on a preset course, these weapons represented a revolutionary leap in naval warfare technology. They were true hunter-killers, autonomous weapons that could actively pursue their targets. The torpedoes contained passive acoustic receivers that detected the sound of ship propellers cutting through water. Once launched, the T-5 would run straight for a predetermined distance, then activate its acoustic guidance system and begin searching for propeller noise. When it detected a target, it would turn toward the sound and accelerate, following the acoustic signature with deadly persistence. The implications were terrifying. Against a conventional torpedo, a ship's captain could maneuver, change speed, or turn sharply to avoid the weapon. But against an acoustic homing torpedo, evasive maneuvers were worse than useless. They actually made the target more vulnerable. The faster a ship's propellers turned during emergency maneuvers, the louder the acoustic signature became, making it easier for the torpedo to track and strike. Allied sailors had whispered about these weapons for months, with a mixture of skepticism and dread. There had been incidents, escort ships destroyed while maneuvering to avoid attacks, destroyers hit from impossible angles, vessels sunk without anyone seeing the torpedo's wake or having any warning before impact. Survivors described hearing their own propellers growing louder just before the explosion, as if the ship itself had drawn the weapon toward it. Now, here was the proof, captured intact, complete with technical manuals that explained exactly how the guidance system worked, its effective range, its targeting parameters, and most importantly, its limitations and vulnerabilities. The intelligence officers aboard U-505 immediately recognized the strategic value of this discovery. With these actual torpedoes and their accompanying documentation, Allied engineers could reverse engineer the acoustic guidance system, understand its operating frequencies, and develop countermeasures. The balance of technological advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic had just shifted dramatically. But the acoustic torpedoes, as valuable as they were, represented only the beginning of U-505's intelligence treasure trove. As the search teams moved deeper into the submarine, they began cataloging an astonishing array of technical equipment and classified documents. The radio room yielded navigation charts showing detailed routes through minefields that Allied commanders had suspected but never confirmed. The captain's safe contained patrol orders, operational directives, and communications that revealed German naval strategy across the entire Atlantic theater. They found the U-boat's war diary, a detailed log of every patrol, every encounter, every attack the submarine had conducted since its commissioning. This single document provided insights into German tactical doctrine, the effectiveness of Allied countermeasures, and the locations where U-boats typically operated. Intelligence analysts could cross-reference the diary entries with their own records of ship losses and convoy attacks, filling in gaps in their understanding of how the Battle of the Atlantic had unfolded. In the crew quarters, they discovered personal items that seemed insignificant at first, but proved valuable for understanding crew morale and conditions. Letters from home that revealed the deteriorating situation inside Germany. Propaganda materials that showed what information the Nazi regime was feeding its submariners, and technical complaints in maintenance logs that indicated which German shipyards were producing substandard equipment. The engineering spaces contained another treasure, detailed maintenance manuals, equipment specifications, and technical drawings for virtually every system aboard the submarine. These documents would allow Allied engineers to understand exactly how German U-boats functioned, where their weak points were located, and how to design more effective depth charges and anti-submarine weapons. But all of these discoveries, the acoustic torpedoes, the technical manuals, the operational intelligence, paled in comparison to what awaited in a small locked metal locker in the radio room. An intelligence officer used bolt cutters to break the lock open. Inside, wrapped in waterproof canvas, were several leather-bound books with embossed German naval eagles on their covers. He opened one carefully, and his hands began to tremble as he realized what he was looking at. These were Enigma codebooks. The daily keys, monthly settings, and cipher cipher tables used to encrypt virtually all German naval communications. The Enigma machine itself sat nearby on its mounting bracket, its 3 rotors still set to June 4th's daily configuration. The machine was an electromechanical cipher device that looked deceptively simple: a keyboard, a lamp board, and 3 rotating wheels. But its ability to generate trillions of possible cipher combinations had made German military communications virtually unbreakable using conventional cryptanalysis, or so the Germans believed. In reality, Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park in England had been reading German naval Enigma messages since 1941, thanks to captured cipher materials from earlier operations and the brilliant mathematical work of cryptanalysts like Alan Turing. But breaking Enigma was never a one-time achievement. It required a constant supply of fresh information because the Germans regularly changed their cipher settings and procedures. The codebooks found aboard U-505 were exactly what the codebreakers needed. They contained the daily key settings for the entire month of June 1944, the Kurzsignal codebook for compressed transmissions, the weather short signal book for meteorological observations, and various special cipher tables for high-priority communications. Each of these documents represented hundreds of hours of German cryptographic work designed to keep naval communications secure. Together, they provided Allied codebreakers with a window into the entire German naval cipher system, not just for one submarine or one region, but for the entire Atlantic U-boat fleet. The intelligence officer carefully repacked the codebooks and called for armed guards. These documents were potentially more valuable than the submarine itself. If the Germans discovered they had been captured, they would immediately implement new cipher procedures, destroying years of Allied cryptanalytic progress and potentially extending the war by months. As news of the discoveries spread among the boarding parties and intelligence teams, a sense of both elation and urgent concern gripped everyone involved in the operation. They had captured something unprecedented: technological secrets that could save thousands of Allied lives, intelligence that could shorten the war, and cryptographic materials that could give the Allies an insurmountable advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic. But that advantage existed only as long as the Germans remained ignorant of the capture. Captain Gallery, reviewing the inventory of captured materials, immediately understood the implications. This wasn't just a matter of military security, it was a strategic imperative that would require measures almost as extraordinary as the capture itself. The Germans could not be allowed to know that U-505 had been taken intact, not just for weeks or months, but for the duration of the war. Every German spy, every neutral observer, every captured prisoner who might be exchanged, none of them could learn that U-505 was now in American hands with all its secrets intact. The submarine would have to disappear from history, and so would its crew. Section 4. The men who became ghosts. The 59 German sailors from U-505 had no idea they were about to vanish from the world. They had been fished from the Atlantic, wet and exhausted but alive, by American destroyer escorts that treated them with surprising decency. Hot coffee, dry blankets, medical attention for the injured. Some of the Americans even spoke a little German, offering reassuring words. The prisoners expected what every captured soldier expected: interrogation, processing through prisoner of war channels, eventual transfer to a POW camp, and most importantly, notification to their families through the International Red Cross that they had survived. None of that would happen. The decision came from the highest levels of American command. After urgent consultations involving the Navy Department, the Office of Strategic Services, and eventually the White House itself, an extraordinary order was issued. The crew of U-505 would be completely isolated from the normal prisoner of war system. They would be hidden, held incommunicado, and denied all contact with the outside world for the duration of the war. The moral implications were profound and troubling. The Geneva Conventions guaranteed prisoners of war certain basic rights, including notification of their families through neutral channels. What was being proposed was a clear violation of international law, but the military necessity was deemed overwhelming. British intelligence estimated that if Germany learned U-505 had been captured intact, the resulting cipher changes could extend the war by 6 months and cost hundreds hundreds of thousands of additional casualties. The lives of 59 men, and the rights of their families to know they were alive, were weighed against those numbers and found wanting. The prisoners arrived at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, in late June 1944. They were taken to a specially prepared compound within the larger camp, a prison within a prison, isolated by additional fencing, guard towers, and layers of security that separated them from thousands of other German and Italian POWs held at the facility. The first indication that something was deeply wrong came when they were told they would not be registered with the International Red Cross. No forms to fill out, no notification sent to Germany. Their families would not be informed they were alive. The reactions ranged from confusion to anger to quiet terror. Some protested that this violated international law. Others simply couldn't comprehend what was happening. A few wondered if they had been classified as war criminals, destined for something worse than ordinary imprisonment. The camp commandant could only tell them that their status was classified for military reasons. They would be treated humanely, adequate food, shelter, medical care, exercise, but no contact with the outside world, no mail in or out, no Red Cross visits, no interaction with other prisoners who might mention their existence. They had become ghosts. Meanwhile, in Germany, the machinery of death notification ground forward with bureaucratic efficiency. The Kriegsmarine documented U-505 as sunk with heavy casualties on June 4, 1944. Telegrams were prepared, letters were written. In dozens of German towns and cities, families received the news that fathers, sons, and brothers had been lost at sea. Frau Lange, wife of the submarine's captain Harold Lange, received official notification that her husband was presumed dead. She began wearing black. Memorial services were held. Life continued without him. In small villages and industrial cities across Germany, similar scenes played out. The family of Maschinenmat Walter Loder, the chief mechanic who had tried desperately to save the flooding submarine, mourned their lost son. Dozens of families grieved for men who sat very much alive in Louisiana, struggling to understand their bizarre fate. The psychological impact on the prisoners was severe and grew worse over time. In the first weeks, many maintained hope that their isolation was temporary. But as weeks turned to months, the reality became inescapable. They would remain in this limbo for the duration of the war. The knowledge that their families believed them dead created a unique form of torment. They could imagine the grief, the memorial services, the slow process of moving on. Some men coped through military discipline, maintaining routines and keeping their skills sharp. Others struggled with depression and despair. The guards, mostly young American soldiers, were under strict orders not to fraternize or discuss the outside world, especially anything about naval operations. But human nature prevailed, and over time, a strange understanding developed. Not friendship, but a mutual recognition of shared humanity despite the war. The German sailors organized themselves according to rank, maintaining discipline within their isolated compound. They created educational programs, taught each other languages and skills, played cards and simple sports. They tried to maintain normalcy in profoundly abnormal circumstances, but always, the knowledge hung over them. Somewhere in Germany, their families were mourning men who were alive. For the intelligence officers who had made this decision, the arrangement was a necessary evil, a temporary violation of human decency, justified by the enormous strategic stakes. The secrets of U-505 had to remain secure until the war ended. Then, they promised themselves the prisoners would be released and reunited with their families. The deception worked perfectly. German Naval Command never suspected that U-505 had been captured intact. They believed it sank during the engagement, taking its Enigma materials and acoustic torpedoes to the bottom. No cipher changes were implemented. No security alerts were issued. Allied codebreakers continued reading German naval communications with the same advantage they had before, now enhanced by the detailed materials from U-505. Convoys were routed around U-boat patrol lines. Wolfpack assembly points were detected and attacked. The intelligence advantage that might have been lost was instead preserved and strengthened. The codebooks Hitler couldn't afford to lose had been lost, and the Frere would never know. But the human cost of that victory sat in Louisiana, counting the days until a war would end and they could tell the world they were still alive. Epilogue: When Ghosts Came Home. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, the men of U-505 heard the news with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Finally, they thought they could go home. Finally, they could let their families know they had survived. But even then, the process took months. Security protocols had to be carefully managed. The men were gradually integrated into the regular POW system, processed for repatriation, and eventually shipped back to Germany. When they finally arrived home, the reunions were extraordinary and heartbreaking. Families who had mourned for over a year suddenly discovered their loved ones were alive. Joy mixed with anger, confusion, and the trauma of unnecessary grief. Harold Lang returned to find his wife had begun rebuilding her life without him. The psychological scars of his panic during the engagement, combined with the knowledge of what his premature abandoned ship order had cost Germany, haunted him for the rest of his life. U-505 itself survived the war and was eventually donated to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where it remains on display today, the only German U-boat in the United States. Visitors walk through its cramped compartments, marveling at the technology, unaware of the full story of its capture, and the men who became ghosts to protect its secrets. The acoustic torpedoes found aboard led directly to the development of Allied countermeasures that saved countless ships. The Enigma materials extended the Allies' code-breaking advantage through the final year of the war. The intelligence gathered from U-505's documents and equipment contributed to the final defeat of the U-boat threat. Historians estimate that the capture of U-505 and the preservation of its secrets shortened the Battle of the Atlantic by months and saved thousands of lives. But for 59 German sailors and their families, the cost was measured differently. In a year of unnecessary grief, in violated rights, in the strange limbo between life and death that they endured so that others might live. It was a bargain made in the desperate mathematics of war, where 59 men were weighed against thousands, and their humanity was temporarily set aside for the greater good. History remembers the capture of U-505 as a triumph of naval audacity and intelligence warfare. The men who lived through it remember something more complicated.